5.6 Control Scope. Control scope is the process of monitoring the status of the project and product scope and managing changes to the scope baseline. The key benefit of this process is that the scope baseline is maintained throughout the project. This process is performed throughout the project. PMBOK Guide page 167. As I mentioned earlier, most of the processes in the PMBOK Guide are not just once off, they're repeated throughout the project. Likewise with the various documents and baselines, they too are progressively elaborated, refined and maintained. In the case of the scope statement, it is controlled and maintained within this process. As project managers, we are charged with protecting the scope of our projects, but that doesn't mean the scope can't be changed, because indeed it must, but changes are permitted only if authorised through the change control system. Then any authorised changes will be reflected not only in the scope statement but in any other relevant documents and baselines formally changed. Remember, as I said before, formal or formally means it is signed, and it could be a formal written signature or an email or some other method or electronic signature, as long as it can be stored against the item to prove that it's been accepted or authorised. And a baseline is a chart report or similar which has been formally accepted. Figure 5.17 shows the inputs, tools and techniques and outputs for this process. Input number 1 is a project management plan, which you will recall is a collection of 18 sub-plans, baselines and the life cycle, which are used to manage the project. In the early versions of PMBOK Guide, the project management plan was just called the project plan. However, as I've said a couple of times before, many inexperienced project managers and lots of highly paid consultants tend to call the project schedule the project plan, and so PMI renamed it to the project management plan in an attempt to avoid confusion. The project management plan, for example, includes the project charter, the scope management plan, the schedule management plan, the quality management plan, the risk management plan and so on, as well as the project schedule. So if you go into the exam thinking that the project management plan is just a schedule, you will get a bunch of questions wrong. But back to input number 1, the project management plan. The first sub-plan is the scope management plan. This contains all the details of how the project scope and the product scope will be controlled, as well as the details of the necessary documents. Sub-plan number 2 is the requirements management plan, which describes how the requirements will be managed. You will need this because the control scope process includes the ability to make changes to the requirements through change control. Subplan number 3 is the change management plan, which defines the process for managing changes to the project. Number 4 is the configuration management plan, which defines those items which are configurable. Which really means items that you can apply a version control to. It also defines those items which require formal change those which require formal change control, as well as a process for controlling changes to configurable items. Subplan number 4 is actually a group with 3 subplans: the scope baseline, which is the approved version of the scope statement, the work breakdown structure baseline and a work breakdown structure dictionary baseline. In actual projects, when considering changes to the scope, the team will normally examine the work breakdown structure first and then the scope statement. And subplan number 5 is the performance measurement baseline. Later in the course we will be studying the earned value technique. It's a means of objectively measuring actual performance against planned performance, and in this case it is used to determine if a change, corrective action or preventative action is actually necessary. Input number 2, project documents. This group will be concerned mainly with the lessons learned register and the requirements documentation. And these are the same project documents which are inputs to the validated scope process. Let's see how they're used in this process. Lessons learned register, to see what tips and tricks we have learned from performing this process before and we'll be using to improve this and later iterations. Requirements documentation, to detect deviations in agreed scope for any product. Requirements traceability matrix, to detect the impact of any change or any deviation from the agreed scope on any requirements. The requirements traceability matrix also holds information on the current status of any requirement. Input number 3 is work performance data, which holds the number of change requests received, the number of requests accepted, and the number of deliverables verified, validated, and completed. Input number 4, the final input, is organizational process assets. You will probably have noticed that in most times, organizational process assets appears to be an input to a process. It is usually paired with enterprise environmental factors. And the fact it does not appear in this process means that you need to remember it for the exam, because PMI likes to test you on your knowledge of exceptions. In the organizational process assets, we were looking at existing formal and informal scope, control-related policies, procedures, guidelines, and monitoring and reporting methods and templates to be used. I believe that formal and informal scope, control-related policies is an error in the PMBOK guide, because as far as I am aware, there's no such thing as informal scope. So I suspect what they mean to say is formal or informal, scope control-related policies, i.e. formal scope control-related policies and informal scope-related control policies, if you can follow what I mean. Now for the tools and techniques. This time there are two under the single heading of data analysis. They are variance analysis. This compares the actual results against a baseline to see if there's a variance, and if there is, it checks to see if the variance is within acceptable limits. If it's not, corrective or preventative action needs to be taken. Corrective action is to fix a problem, and preventive action is to prevent a problem from occurring. But if either action is required, it is very important to remember that you can't just take the actions unless they're first authorized by change control. Trend analysis. This is the second tool under data analysis, and this is used to determine if performance is getting better or worse over a period of time. And the output of this analysis can also be used to decide if preventative action will be needed. Moving to the outputs from scope control, the first one is work performance information. This report is a comparison of the actual performance of project scope and product scope against baseline. It has information on the received changes, scope variances, and what caused the variances, and how the variances will impact schedule or cost now and in the future. Output number 2 is change requests, which is a list of change requests generated to correct the variances that were detected by the control scope process. These change requests will become an input to the perform integrated change control process. Output number 3 is the project management plan updates, which are principally scope management plan, because during the control scope process we may discover changes or improvements to the way we are managing scope. Scope baseline to reflect the approved changes to the scope, the work statement, the work breakdown structure, or the work breakdown structure dictionary. Schedule baseline to reflect approved changes to the scope, resources, or schedule estimates. The cost baseline to reflect approved changes to the scope, resources, or cost estimates. Performance measurement baseline to reflect approved changes to the scope, schedule, performance, or cost estimates. In each of the above baseline updates, in extreme cases the changes may be so great that revised baselines need to be issued to provide a more realistic view of the actual situation. And finally, output number 4, project document updates. There are 3 of these listed, but I should point out that in each process the PMBOK guide lists what it believes to be the minimum for reliable project management. You may include others, but do so with care, because the project management might become burdensome on the team members. You might even reduce the inputs, tools and techniques or outputs, but you're strongly advised not to, because you might contribute to your project's failure. A tip for the exam is that the questions will assume that you're using all inputs, all tools and techniques, and all outputs for your project. The project document updates will be lessons learned register, the requirements documentation. It needs to be updated to reflect new requirements and change requirements. Requirements traceability matrix updated to reflect new requirements and change requirements. And that brings us to the end of control scope process. And it's also the end of the project scope management module. The next module is project schedule management. Please read the corresponding chapter on the PMBOK guide before watching the video. Project schedule management was called project time management in previous editions of the PMBOK guide. If your study materials talk about project time management, then I would strongly advise not using them. There are a lot of changes in the PMBOK guide 6th edition, and you put yourself at risk of failing the exam by studying the wrong version.